Thanks, Bianca, and thanks for the opportunity to speak here today. It's quite a diverse audience. I'm really pleased to be here and looking forward to some of the presentations that are going to follow over the next half a day and tomorrow. So, first of all, I thought Margie Prideaux's presentation was fantastic and highlighted the challenges around bushfire, which is that really, like all fire safety strategies, there's two sides. There's fire prevention and fire protection. So Peter Jacklin just spoke about fire prevention, which ironically is being done by lighting fires, but catastrophic bushfire prevention can be done that way. The National Construction Code is our fire protection strategy, the other side of that coin. I also should declare not a conflict of interest, but a bias, because Dr. Prideaux was quite critical of the National Code and laws. I'm one of the industry representatives on the Australian Building Codes Board, so to some extent I'm responsible for those delays. And I think we should acknowledge, well, two things. One of my favourite quotes, H.L. Mencken, an American essayist, talked about, for every complex problem, there's a simple solution that's neat, convenient and wrong. So that's the dilemma around bushfire. So I'm going to talk today at a very high level about the National Construction Code issues, but really I'll be touching on many of the other themes that are being presented in a lot of the other presentations today and tomorrow. So let's go. As I said, I'll give a brief overview of the policy requirements in the National Construction Code, some policy and challenges that I think we're still going to face, the new NCC provisions for Class 9 buildings, which are, frankly, a once-in-a-generation reform in the National Construction Code. I should say, when Bianca asked the audience, we didn't ask if there were many town planners in the room. One of the challenges I think the National Construction Code faces is the complementary and contradictory mesh of planning and building. And I can see nods heading from people. So this is a frankly national problem, not of our own making deliberately, but because we're trying to deal with such a complex issue. So I'm going to mention planning for bushfire once and then say I'm from Victoria. I have no idea what that means, which is a problem, isn't it? And then I'll talk briefly, one slide, about some challenges. So what I wanted to do is just remind us that we actually don't live in a united Australia. We live in a federation, a divided states of Australia, perhaps. Each state and territory has its own legislation scheme. We administer that through Act, Regs, National Construction Code. Local government does the enforcement and administration of that. And the federal government complies, frankly, when it wants to. That's how the law works. Just because we've got a referendum coming up, I thought this was worth adding. The Australian Constitution is really clear about this. It was the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act set by the UK Parliament, of course, because Australia didn't exist. And it essentially says that laws that existed within the colonies will remain with the states. So that's the great challenge for us, isn't it? The National Construction Code has been the great reform of my lifetime, but it's struggling at the moment. It's falling apart. And part of it is this frantic attempt by states to catch up with climate change and other pressures. It's not deliberate, we're not doing it deliberately, but it is a problem. And if nothing else, all of us after this conference can go back to our day-to-day jobs and have some small amount of influence on our politicians to say that we have to treat bushfire as a national issue. It's not a state issue. Bushfires do not care about state rivalry. So, in terms of 9 different governments and 8 different regulatory schemes, the things I can say for sure that occur in every state and territory are that we have 3 prime sections: a design process, a building process and an occupation process. And pretty much all of us in the room will work in one of those sectors, sometimes 2, very rarely 3. The critical compliance points in law are at the end of the design process, and I've put there things like compliance with AS 3959, the issue of a building approval. And again, I can't use specific language because every state and territory has a different term there. So for example, I'm a building surveyor, which in Victoria means something different, but in New South Wales, I'm actually a certifier. It's the same job. At the end of the building process, we have completion of building work, approval to occupy, particularly issue of approval documents, occupation certificates, I think that is a right New South Wales term, for vegetation management, maintenance, etc. And there's some interesting presentations coming up this afternoon on that, which I'm particularly interested to speak about. And then the occupation process. And of course, that's where the big question mark is at the moment. We haven't done much work there. We've certainly never had nationally requirements for significant retrospective recompliance for housing. So this is a slide that took me the most time to write, and it's got the least amount of words on it probably, but I think the challenges we face can be divided into three policy circles. And in typical engineering term, I'm going to use a Venn diagram. So bushfire life safety, that's the prime goal of governments and the National Construction Code. So making sure we keep people safe enough, not safe, not so that no life is ever lost, but safe enough, and I'll come back to that. Then we have private interest insurability. There's a presentation this afternoon from the Resilient Buildings Council about the insurance challenges we're facing. The insurers are just in the business of making money, and if the fires are greater, the premiums have to go up. So, for example, New Zealand has had a natural disaster fund for decades because of their earthquake risk. And maybe we need to start talking about whether we would have a nationally funded insurance scheme. But as soon as I say that, I feel like I'm a socialist and I'm going to be criticised, because that's a political issue, isn't it? But if we all contributed something, even the people who live in cities, to a national disaster fund, then like New Zealand has done, they funded the rebuild of Christchurch after the earthquake with that $6.3 billion, I think. They emptied the bank account, but they're now refilling it. Of course, the last issue is where the Class 9 provisions really start to hit the ground now. So this is the public interest building protection, the secondary goal of governments and the National Construction Code. Some of you might have a view that the National Construction Code is really only about life safety, but that's not true. It's fundamentally also about property protection, but only in the public interest. So whether my house burns down is not an issue around the building code, as long as everybody is safe enough. But if a whole community burns down, that's a problem. And if you think that's a challenging comment, then why would we regulate termite protection? Because you can't die from a termite bite, and the structural collapse is so slow that it's almost impossible to die from the structural collapse from a termite bite. But if we lose a whole township from a termite infestation, that's a problem. So that's why the building code regulates termite protection, and corrosion resistance, particularly in marine areas, is another example. So this overlap in this Venn diagram is where AS 3959 and planning schemes for housing come in. We're trying to make sure buildings are safe enough to protect people and that there isn't a catastrophic loss of a whole community. Of course, that opens up a whole discussion around stay or go, which I'm not even going to, other than say it, I'm not even going to go into that discussion, because that's, again, a complicated issue that climate change is really making us refocus on. Well, I will say something. In Victoria, we used to have a slogan, which is, people save houses because houses save people. But history told us that if you stayed to defend your home, then your home would survive, because that was the fire history we had. And we now know that that can have catastrophic outcomes if you stay in the wrong sort of fire. The overlap between public interest building protection and private interest insurability is a fascinating one, isn't it? So this is well, hospitals, the best example is a hospital. It's the most focusing building group I can think of. So I've got a slide on that, which I'll come to in a moment. But hospitals need to operate before a bushfire, during the heat death problem, the heat load on the community, because there's an increased number of people dying from heat stroke, during the fire and after the fire. Now, I can't think of a more challenging design scenario than that. You've got a building that has to operate during a bushfire whilst a fire might be passing over the top of it. And that's what the new building code requirements are trying to achieve. And again, that's where the 9C provisions come in there. And really, the reason governments have taken so long and the reason these reforms are difficult is because that's the policy sweet spot. Building codes are meant to be the minimum standard. And again, I was really fascinated by Margot Prideaux's presentation, because she was talking about Governments failing because minimum standards aren't enough. This is that great dilemma, isn't it? In everything else in our life, if governments regulated best practice, we'd squeal and complain. But when governments don't regulate best practice, in this case, we complain. It's the great challenge of climate change, really. So, on that note, absolute safety costs an infinite amount of money, doesn't it? That's obvious. So everything has to have a cost-benefit analysis, and that's the dilemma. The great challenge and the great tragedy, frankly, around bushfire is that it disproportionately affects people of a low socioeconomic status. And they're the ones least likely to be able to afford better than minimum standards. And again, my job here... yeah. See, whenever a Victorian fire engineer comes to New South Wales, that's what you do to us. You don't like us. That's why I'm also a part-time academic at the School of Architecture at the University of Melbourne, so I'll grab my architectural colleague and claim 2 in the audience today. I had a whole lecture evacuate once from a fire alarm, and all the students thought I'd set it up myself, which I didn't. If you're interested, all those tones come from an Australian standard and are in the building code. But yeah, as a fire safety engineer, there's one thing: if there's a fire, please try and keep up. Okay, so cost versus safety. Again, building codes are not the word safe is a problem. I do a lot of legal work now because of a whole heap of compliance issues. And sometimes lawyers say, is this building safe? And the answer has to be, well, that depends. Compliance, safe means different things, and governments spend all of their time trying to regulate what is safe enough or safer. And the reason I put this slide in is because, frankly, environmental changes are challenging those current values. So you might be surprised to know, but some of you will already know, that most of the Australian standards that we've got in the building code, in fact that we've got nationally, were developed from the last 50 or 100 years of data. We look backwards to work out what the future should be. And guess what climate change is telling us? That doesn't work anymore. So one of the things we spent a lot of time at the Australian Building Codes Board discussing at board meetings is, what is the factor you would add to those codes for climate change? And if you have an answer, please go grab me in the break, because we have no idea. But some of the great work that's being done by CSIRO is helping us to understand that the bushfire risk is the greatest risk to Australia from climate change, with daylight second. So that's why we're all here today. But reminding us all that absolute safety costs an infinite amount of money. So in every state or territory, you have an Act Regs BCA and standards. 3959 sits awkwardly there at the bottom of the table, given most of us spend a lot of our time dealing with this code, but it's important to remind ourselves about that. The building code used to previously only deal with housing. And again, one of the challenges of emerging regulatory issues is that we start with where the problem is. And losing thousands of houses in bushfires was a problem, and we weren't losing thousands of hospitals or schools. We occasionally lose hospitals or schools, and fortunately without any loss of life usually. So what that means is that actually goes against another policy problem, because if you lived in a cyclonic area, and some of you probably do, you would know that, in fact, just from watching world news now, you would know that if you're in an area where a cyclone or a hurricane is going to occur and you're in an old house, you need to move to a safer building, because the local shopping centre, the local sports stadium is between 10 and 100 times more structurally secure than a house. In bushfire, we flipped that, haven't we? Because if you're in a 3959 house, you should not drive to your local school, because probably that was built to no bushfire standards, or your local hospital, or your local every other public building. And again, that's a real challenge for regulators because subconsciously, and again, I've spoken to Justin Leonard and others about this, sometimes people in a bushfire fill their bath up with water and go to the middle of the house because their subconscious is telling them this is what you do from what you've seen on Hollywood movies around cyclones. Because in a cyclone, probably the smallest room is the safest part of the house. But in a bushfire, that could be the worst possible spot. So, the performance-based NCC, I should say the National Construction Code series is the correct title. I'm going to use NCC and BCA I'm going to intermingle those terms. We're going to talk about Building Codes Volume 1 and 2 and then the Plumbing Code. It's correct to use both terms unless you're certifying something. If you're certifying compliance, you can't use NCC unless you actually do believe you comply with the Plumbing Code. So you should use Building Code of Australia Volume 1 or 2. But we, like most building things, we've developed a shorthand term and we call it the NCC. But strictly speaking, that's a series of 3 documents. So it's a performance-based code. The NCC includes prescriptive, what we call deemed to satisfy provisions. The beauty of deemed to satisfy provisions are that they guarantee us compliance at law because we can't define safety. Does that sound good? Not if you live in the 3959, AS 3959 world. But it is also true to say that not one Australian standard in the National Construction Code series is mandatory. Australian standards are not mandatory. They're one of the optional deemed to satisfy solutions. But of course, that's where all of the industry lives because that's where the production line code compliant world is. That's the most important part of the building code for a builder, for a subcontractor, for a product supplier, and there's a few in the room. But actually the building code is performance based, and I'll talk about why that's the case. So there's the best prescriptive regulation I know of. Peter, if you're still there, that's the Stuart Highway. And the reason I use this is because the Northern Territory's had 2 go at performance-based speed limits. Both times they failed because, and I particularly love this picture, so that's about a 20-year-old, there actually already is a verification method in the building code, but it doesn't work, it doesn't apply to Class 9 buildings, so we can't use that. So here's how this all comes together. For Class 1 houses and Class 10 outbuildings, we've got performance requirement H7P5. I'm not going to spend much time on this because I've got a lot of slides to get through, but you can look this up yourself. The requirements for Class 1, 2, 3 and 4 parts of buildings are the same, 4 criteria, but of course you can follow AS 3959 and you don't have to assess any of that. The assumption is that if you follow the standard, you're deemed to comply with those words. Whether you do or not is not for the design construction process to deal with. That's how deeming provisions work. Just think of it like driving down the road with a blood alcohol level of 0.049 in a car that's just roadworthy in the fog. That's compliant. And again, typically it's one of those, a performance solution or AS 3959. In my experience, most of the industry only proceeds to a performance solution if 3959 compliance can't be achieved, and that's a good practical outcome of industry common sense, I think. Again, for exactly the same provision, so again, I don't need to go through the words in detail, they're exactly the same as the Class 1A performance requirement, but it's G5P1. I should have said at the start, 1st of May 2023 was the new National Construction Code 2022 edition. It's full of some significant reforms. 2 of the others are disability access into dwellings and 7-star energy efficiency. And those things won't make bushfire worse, will they? Think about that. We're going to have wheelchair accessible houses and we have to line them with more and more combustible materials to get to 7-star. So this is that challenging policy framework we live in at the moment. And again, the same outcome, 3959 gets you there under the National Construction Code or a performance solution if you can't. But this is the new bit, G5P2. And again, it's not the purpose of this presentation to go through this in detail, but you'll see there is some very challenging issues there for how A public building would operate before, during and after a bushfire. And you'll see down the bottom it applies to Class 9A healthcare buildings, so hospitals, low care, high care, aged care, kindergartens, primary schools, secondary schools, residential care buildings. So not all Class 9 buildings, so not universities, for example. Primary and secondary schools, but not universities. It's a narrow group, and this is the start of the regulatory evolution process. And again, if you're up to BEL 12.5, so a pragmatic solution to a problem that we don't really have other solutions for yet. If you can get a public building on a BEL 12.5 site or less, that's a heck of a start. And if you do that, 3959 for a hospital, it's not the code, just think about that. The Australian standard developed for houses is being applied to a hospital, plus specification 43, which covers all of the other issues. Separation distances, and tries to pick up all of the limitations of 3959, not because 3959 is not a very good document, but because it wasn't designed for hospitals. And then of course the last bit, the bit that's frankly scary because we're at the very start of this journey. If you've got a site that's BEL 19 or higher and you want to build a Class 9 building, you have to go to a pure performance-based design. So a BPAD level 3, this is underpants on the outside stuff. This is really tricky. And I would say, as we go through this journey, the way we can protect ourselves is to use documents like the Australian Fire Engineering Guidelines, which tell us to, as designers, whether you're a BPAD level 3 or a fire safety engineer, to consult widely with authorities, particularly the fire brigade. Consult widely, that's the way we protect the system. So just to finish on an example of why this issue is so challenging, think about life safety, property protection, private interest protection. I just grabbed the descriptors from AS 3959 2009, not because they're wrong, but because they're not in the current version, because to an uninformed reader they can be confusing. So BEL low, very low risk, but actually 1 kilowatt per square metre is the sun on a typical day. 2 will give you sunburn, 6.4 will give you pain after 8 seconds. So BEL 12.5 is not something you want to stand outside in. 10 kilowatts pain after 3 seconds. So you'll see in the building code requirements for outdoor areas to be kept no more than 1 kilowatt per square metre above ambient. So on a hot day, no more than 2 kilowatts. Because if you've got areas in a building where people who can't fit in the building because you've exceeded the population need to be held outside, in a hospital, for example, family, friends, visitors, that area has to have a very, very low threshold of radiant heat flux. Again, most of you will know this off the top of your head, but BEL 19, 16 kilowatts blistering of skin after 5 seconds. So this is that dilemma around hardware solutions for buildings as opposed to software solutions for people in the buildings. So people being in buildings or near buildings is a very challenging design scenario. So why has this occurred? Governments don't usually regulate before they have a problem, but climate change is making this worse. I think I've covered that. Technical standards and regulations evolve over time, so don't misunderstand the building code as a perfect solution for every problem. It can never be that. It's the start of a minimum standard approach. That's why we actually have a performance-based code to allow for innovation and future-proofing of buildings as best as possible. Performance-based regulations require increased education skills, auditing, enforcement. Again, most of you would be familiar with that. Increased compliance costs. If it's harder to do, it's got to cost more money. Sorry about that, but also increased authority consultation. And I know fire brigades around the country are trying to get their head around this issue. Frankly, being a firefighter at the moment is one of the most tough jobs you can imagine, because if you're in the country, you've got bushfire. If you're in the city now, you've got a whole range of changing fuel technologies driving all sorts of issues. As a fire safety engineer, I spend a lot of time now on EV vehicles and what we're going to do about those sorts of fires. And we haven't even got to hydrogen fires yet. Again, the greater need for regulation over the life of a building. Again, that themes in the rest of the program. So is it a real problem? This is a slide I added just last night. We're doing an audit in Victoria of registered state government hospitals, and it turns out there's 212 sites, and 1 in 3 are in bushfire-prone areas. They're existing hospitals. So this issue around building resilience is real. It's not just about, everyone wants to take a picture of that one. It's going to get me in trouble, that slide, I know it is, but it's the truth, and it's all in the public domain if you can. Yeah, thanks, Trevor. So because I'm a little bit over time, I'm going to run through this. I touched on this briefly before. Exposed external areas. If you read the building code and you have an interest in this, you'll see things now that hopefully make a bit more sense because I've started to unpack the reasons why. Access and evacuation areas have to have a very low BAL, if you like, because bushfire attack level relates to a building, not to people. Don't confuse BAL as something that people can withstand. I'm going to jump ahead of that because I wanted to go to one last slide. Thank you. So, future regulatory challenges, increased education skills, registration, licensing and auditing enforcement for key practitioners. Easy to say, but there's a lot to that. We don't have a national registration scheme for fire engineers. We don't have national recognition of the BPAD scheme. We've got a lot of work to do in this space and all of us can help drive this forward. Regulations for adequate documentation of decisions, technical and research documentation to support those decisions over the life of the building, conditions of occupancy, regulator reassessment of systems and people. And this is the biggest one for me. Again, I just added this yesterday. We have to have a mature discussion around retrospective upgrading of existing buildings. We're going to talk through the next half a day and tomorrow about building resilience. But in my view, the building code regulates for building resilience, but can never regulate for community resilience. Well, not never, but if you think of 100 houses in a community, how many of those are actually compliant with the current building code? 1? So as over time, it might take certainly 30, but potentially 60 years to increase the stock in a whole community to get to the point where every building is compliant with the current standard. Think about cars on the road for the same example. So we have to think about and discuss voluntary upgrading of buildings, insurance-driven upgrade of buildings, and again, the Resilient Building Council presentation this afternoon from Kylie Steele will cover that in some, help explain that a bit more, or regulatory intervention. And retrospective legislation for existing houses is an awkward discussion, but we have to have it. And if this group can't have that discussion, I'm not sure who can, because otherwise we can't build community resilience. Thank you. That's it.